Hello everyone! So today I'm going to be showing you how I made the Shimmering Blade for my Auron cosplay. Fair warning, I did challenge myself to make this sword within 24 hours so that I would have it in time to take photos, and while I was successful, it probably didn't come out quite as well as it could have because I wasn't able to go as slow and take as much care as I normally would. But with that in mind, I am really happy with how it came out and I'm excited to share the process with all of you, so let's get started. But before we do, if you like this kind of video, please make sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe to my channel while you're here. Okay, now let's get started. I was able to find a pattern for the sword from a user called Solvash on DeviantArt, so thank you so much to that person and I will link that down below. I got two 1/4 inch steel rods from the hardware store, so I'm just making sure that they fit inside the pattern, which luckily they fit perfectly at about 48 inches long. Next, I just cut out the entire pattern from the PDF template. And this is what it looked like all cut out. I traced 2 copies of the sword onto 2mm craft foam. Then I traced 1 copy onto 10mm EVA foam. As you can see, it was a little bit too long for the piece of foam I had, but that's okay. I just cut it into 2 pieces. This part is going to go on the inside anyway, so no one's going to see it. Next, I cut out all 3 foam pieces of the sword that I just traced. As you can see, the foam doesn't lie totally flat. It started to sort of curl up in some places, so I'm using a heat gun, which actually will cause it to flatten back out. Now I'm going to attach the 2 pieces of the 10mm foam that I cut out, so I'm just using contact cement for that. I apply the contact cement to both pieces and allow it to dry completely before then carefully pressing the pieces together. Next, I'm taking those 2 steel rods that I mentioned earlier and I am aligning them where they are going to go in the middle of the sword for support. One of the pieces wasn't quite bendy enough, so I bent it just slightly until it fit the way that I wanted it to. Now I'm using a pen to just trace a rectangle around where those pieces are going to lie inside the sword. That way I can cut it out and put the steel pipes inside. I'm using a box cutter to cut out that rectangular shape completely out of the 10mm piece of foam. Now that it's cut out, I'm laying one of the 2mm pieces of foam out on the table, and I'm putting the 10mm piece with the cutout over the 2mm piece and lining up the edges. I'm taking those steel rods again and just making sure they fit inside the piece that I just cut out, which they did. Now I'm taking my contact cement and painting the entire side of both pieces of foam with the contact cement and allowing it to dry completely before I then slowly press the pieces together. Once the pieces are pressed together and the contact cement is dry, it forms an extremely tight bond. Now I've basically created a little hole in the middle of the sword where the steel rods will lie, so I am just pressing those down into the contact cement as well. However, it's okay if they don't completely stick to the contact cement because they're going to be held in place by the other 2 pieces of foam. Now I'm repeating the same process with the contact cement. This time I'm painting it onto the top of the 10mm piece of foam in the middle, and I'm going to also add it to the remaining piece of 2mm foam, which will go on top of this one. And again, after allowing both pieces to dry completely, I am then pressing the top piece of foam onto the middle piece. Now I'm using my heat gun again just to flatten out any pieces that might have started to get kind of wavy and basically just make the whole sword flat to the table. Here's how it looks so far. Next I'm going in with some masking tape and I am taping off the portion where the actual slanted, sharp blade is basically going to be, and this portion was marked on the pattern, so that's very helpful, but I'm just taping it off so whenever I start sanding, I don't accidentally sand away any other parts of the sword other than the part that's supposed to be sharpened. Now it's sanding time, so I'm going in with my Dremel and I'm just going to start sanding down the very sharpened edge of the sword at an angle so that it starts to get sort of that sharpened look to it. You can see here how it's starting to create that beveled edge, and I am just doing that all the way down the full length of the sword. This can be by far the most tedious part of the process, but just hang in there. At one point the battery in my Dremel died, so I went in with sandpaper in 60, 100, and 120 grit and just started manually sanding down the edges as well, working from the rougher grit up to the finer grit to basically smooth out the foam as much as possible. I started working my way up from the very edge up to where the tape line is, using it at an angle to just create a kind of gradual slope from where the tape is down to the sharp point. After it's finally all sanded, I'm going back in with my heat gun to heat seal the foam. Unfortunately, my camera didn't really pick it up, but basically, whenever you sand down the foam, you're going to be left with a pretty rough texture on the surface that is visible to your eye, and it doesn't look very good. It doesn't look like metal. So taking heat to the foam actually burns off all the little rough edges and kind of causes it to melt back together and create a smoother texture so that you don't see all those little imperfections. Now it is time to go in with Quick Seal. You may have noticed that after sanding it down, there are some imperfections in the foam that weren't able to be fixed with heat sealing. For example, you can see there's a little bit of a hole or a gap where the foam came apart a little bit too much, and there's some other little imperfections as well. So you can use Quick Seal or any kind of bathroom caulk, kitchen caulk adhesive, and actually use that to fill in those little gaps. It's also a good idea to use a little bit of water on your fingertip like I'm doing here to smooth around the edges of where the Quick Seal meets the foam. That way the Quick Seal itself doesn't create any new bumps or textures in the foam. You want it to just be a very smooth transition from the Quick Seal to the surface. The foam is now ready to be primed for painting, so I am using wood glue as a primer. You can use this by itself or mix it with water for a thinner consistency, but either way it makes an excellent primer for foam. And as you can see, I am just painting it onto the whole sword with a paintbrush. Location change. As you can see, I moved to a different room to continue working on this, but here's what it looked like when the glue was dry and it was completely done being primed. Now I'm working on how to attach the handle. So for the handle of the sword, I am just using a PVC pipe that you can get from any hardware store, and I am just measuring the width of the PVC pipe and cutting that out of the foam with a box cutter, and then just cutting it down a couple of inches, basically so that the PVC pipe is going to fit into the top of the foam. And I am attaching the PVC pipe into that little hole or well that I created using the trusty contact cement. Now obviously I don't want to be able to see that part where the PVC pipe connects into the sword. I'm just measuring out and cutting a piece of 2mm foam that I'm going to use to wrap around that little connection and hide it. I actually ended up redoing this entire process with the handle later off camera, because when I went to pick up the sword I found that I hadn't put the handle in far enough and it was not able to support the giant sword. So I had to go back in, I had to make that little rectangle where I inserted the PVC pipe longer so that the PVC pipe could go in deeper to the foam, and then I had to cut out a whole new rectangle of 2mm foam to cover that as well. So it was the same process that you're seeing here, but you'll notice later that the handle goes deeper inside the foam than what you see here, and that was necessary in order to support the sword. Now it's time to paint this guy. So first I'm actually priming it one last time with Plastidip, which is a rubberized coating. It's a great primer for EVA foam. Doing a couple of coats of that and letting it dry completely in between each coat. Then I'm going in with this black sort of metallic shiny spray paint that I found at the hardware store. Once again, doing a couple of coats of that over the entire sword and letting it dry between each coat. Now I'm using painter's tape to tape off the portions of the sword that are going to remain black because it's time to spray paint the silver portion of the blade. And for that, I'm using this shiny, basically chrome silver spray paint, which came out really perfect. It made the blade look super shiny and pretty realistic. Here's what it looked like after it dried and I removed the painter's tape. Now you can still see some imperfections, so I decided to kind of just roll with it and make the whole sword look just kind of beat up and like it had been used a whole lot. So first I went in with some black metallic paint and brushed that onto the black portions of the sword just to give it some depth and dimension. I'm not totally repainting over it at all. I'm just basically brushing little bits here and there to create little streaks or lines that look like it's a little bit dirty and worn in. And then I'm doing the exact same thing with some darker silver metallic paint on the silver portion of the blade. You can see I'm just dabbing on the tiniest amount and then basically dry brushing it. I don't want to create any big blobs or completely repaint the blade. I just want to make it look like it's kind of scuffed up, and that's going to help to disguise the portions that actually are kind of scuffed up from when I wasn't careful enough with my sanding. Now I'm working on adding the detailing. The pattern that I downloaded came with the pattern for the little swirly part on the top of the blade, so I just cut that out of 2mm foam and I'm painting it to be gold. I also cut out some gold squares and rectangles that I'm going to use to make the details on the hilt as well, and I'm just attaching all of that with contact cement. As you can see, I just kind of wrapped the golden rectangles around different parts of the handle to create the hilt and the pommel at the very top, and I used those little longer pieces to create some dimension on those as well. Now I'm just attaching the gold swirly part onto the top. So for the handle itself, I was considering a couple options. If you look at the reference images, the handle underneath the decorative part actually looks green, but when I looked at it with green in real life, I just didn't really like it, so I decided to wrap it in a piece of brown foam instead. So I just cut out a piece of foam that matched the measurements of the length and width of the piece that I needed to cover and wrapped it around there. Again, looking at the reference images, the handle of Auron's sword has some green and red sort of crisscross details. So I had some green and reddish sparkly ribbon that I used to wrap around the handle in different directions and create that little crisscross design. And for the ribbon, I just secured those pieces with a hot glue gun. Here's how the handle looked with all the details, and I was actually really happy with the way that it came out. I went in and added any finishing touches, for example, painting the very end of the PVC pipe gold because you were still able to see some white in there. And after that, the sword was done. So here's a final couple of views of what it looked like. This isn't the best lighting, but it gives you an idea of how it was looking. Again, I made this sword within 24 hours, so it's not perfect and it's not really my best work, but overall, I'm really excited about the way that it came out. I think it looks pretty good, and here I am holding it for the first time, obviously very excited. And here's another photo of it with the cosplay. So I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If so, again, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next time.